Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking with Rod Dreher about his new book, Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents. You certainly are familiar with him as an individual that we've had on this program before to talk about the Benedict option. I might also mention Crunchy Cons that came out a number of years ago. Serves as the senior editor at the American Conservative, but we certainly have had a chance to read him in the New York Post, the Dallas Morning News, the National Review. So we're going to spend some time talking about this book that came out in late September. So first of all, Rod, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, it's great to be back.
Before we do so, I was in the next hour going to spend some time talking about the actions of Facebook and Twitter. And then I saw a very excellent article by Rod Dreher about that. And for people that aren't familiar, you have on Wednesday the New York Post publishing a really kind of a blockbuster story, if you will, has emails, documents, photographs, and the rest, talking about what has been the case, and people have been following some of this, of the presidential candidate's son, Hunter Biden. And it is, I think, a very significant issue that some people might call an October surprise, but nevertheless, it's worthy of certainly any kind of press coverage. And so you would expect that it would certainly make the rounds, and if some people disagreed with it or saw flaws in it, they would write arguments against it. But instead, what took place is the social media giants, that would be Facebook and Twitter, first Facebook, then Twitter, actually decided, no, we're not even going to make it possible for people to see it. We have a number of individuals who've actually had their accounts blocked, and we've been told that this is posting a danger. So I'd love to get your thoughts about this, since you've written about this and been following the story.
Well, it's really shocking, Kerby, that these people who have such authority over our national discourse, Facebook and Twitter, can decide to censor a story by a major national newspaper just a couple of weeks before the election. But it doesn't really surprise me, because for my book, Live Not by Lies, I spent a lot of time trying to understand the role of Silicon Valley and tech in governing our discourse and manipulating people to stay away from certain conservative points of view and to push them towards liberal points of view. I think in this case, there's been a big uproar against Facebook and Twitter over what they've done. I think they showed their hand, and I hope that people don't forget this, because so many of us don't realize how Facebook and Twitter and the big Silicon Valley tech giants, they are no friends of conservatives or people of faith.
I think most people kind of know that, and I thought I'd use that, if nothing else, as a news peg to talk about your book, because early on you certainly introduce a term that we probably need to define, and that is soft totalitarianism, and that we have been experiencing it for some time, and the example we just used is just one of many. But define that term, because it sort of is key to the rest of what you talk about in your book.
Well, hard totalitarianism is what most of us think about when we think of totalitarianism. It's what they had in the Soviet Union. It's what Stalin did. And it's what George Orwell talks about in his famous novel 1984 that most of us read in high school. I don't think that we're going to have that here in this country. I think rather ours is going to be soft. It'll be no less totalitarian, but they will not depend on pain and terror and sending the secret police over to haul us off to the gulag in order to compel us to conform to the regime. Rather, they're going to use soft methods like manipulating our employment status, by telling us that we can't get the best jobs unless we conform, by ruining our businesses if we fail to conform, that sort of thing. It's still totalitarian because they're forcing us to conform to a very narrow ideology or else, but they're not going to do it in a very brutal way. And that's partly, Kerby, what makes it so difficult for people to see what's happening. Just today as we're talking, I see that a major Dallas ad agency, the Richards Group, founded in 1976. It's a national agency based in Dallas. They are facing a collapse of their business because their 87-year-old owner used an insensitive phrase. He called an ad, a proposed ad, too black. He immediately apologized for it. It doesn't matter. They're losing major clients, national clients. And the government didn't call and tell them to do this, these clients to walk away. They chose to do it on their own because they have absorbed this terror of making a mistake and getting on the wrong side of these social justice warriors. So that's the kind of thing I mean by soft totalitarianism. Again, the government didn't force them to do this, but they have absorbed the ideology themselves, and this is happening in the private sector all the time. You can see a man's life's work, Stan Richards' life's work, being destroyed overnight for one thing he said wrong. And there's no grace for him or anybody who gets on the wrong side of the social justice warriors.
And again, we call that the cancel culture, and whether it's J.K. Rowling, who actually promoted feminism, even sometimes the transgender idea, but if you just stray off the reservation just a little bit, or if you said something back, say in the 1980s, like this executive at Boeing or someone else, it's one strike and you're out, and it doesn't necessarily have to even have happened within the last 24 hours or even within the last month, and it, I think, illustrates the point only so well. And one of the reasons why you have been talking about the idea of the Benedict option, we more recently had Dinesh D'Souza talking about the fact, we're going to just have to provide some alternatives. And we, of course, back in the fundamentalist modernist controversy back in the 1930s, recognized that maybe we shouldn't just always go to the mainstream publishers, but have Christian publishers, and always go to the universities, but have Christian schools and the rest. So in some respects, that's what's kind of coming down the pike in terms of this soft totalitarianism. It doesn't look like somebody marching you off to the gulag. Nobody is put in handcuffs, but the long-term implication is just about the same as if you were in a totalitarian state. True?
That's true. A lot of Christians are going to find this out when they or their children want to go into medicine or law, and they find that they can't get into medicine and get licensed unless they agree to give abortions or to ratify transgenderism. I have a story in my book, Live Not by Lies, told to me by a doctor who's very high up in a major hospital system in the U.S. He would not let me use his name. He was born in the Soviet Union, converted to Christianity when he got to America. And he said that the hospital system sent out a ruling to all the doctors saying that if somebody shows up, a minor or an adult, and wants transgender therapy, wants cross-sex hormones or surgery, we're going to give it to them as a matter of policy, even if the doctor believes that in that specific case it's not useful. It can actually hurt them. This is the ideologization of medicine. And this doctor is so afraid to talk about it. He wouldn't even, he said on his social media, he doesn't talk about anything controversial.
Isn't that amazing?
He knows the hospital's human resources department is monitoring it.
Yeah.
So these little death by 1,000 cuts is how we're getting soft totalitarianism in this country. And most of us Americans can't see it. We're like the frog in the boiling water.
Yes. Well, let's take a break. And when I come back, I want to talk about Father Kolakovic and some of the lessons maybe we can learn from some that have faced totalitarianism. All part of the book, Live, Not by Lies. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
One of the criticisms of the claims of human-caused climate change is that the theory predicts everything. Now, you might think that makes it a good theory. Actually, when you have a theory that predicts everything and cannot be falsified, that makes it a bad theory. In fact, it's easy to find examples of contradictory claims all being attributed to climate change. But let me give you one example. Sharks fascinate us, probably going back decades to the movie Jaws. We seem fascinated by them as illustrated by the popularity of Shark Week on television. So what do scientists predict about sharks and climate change? One article from a few years ago in The Guardian explains that the surge in fatal shark attacks is blamed on global warming. The article does acknowledge that some of the increase may also be due to human activity and the abundance of seals, but the primary reason for the surge in attacks is climate change. A more recent article in The Independent predicts that global warming could actually make sharks smaller and less aggressive. The argument is that warmer waters and increased CO2 could make it more difficult for sharks to catch prey. A third article comes from scientists in Australia who believe that a new hybrid shark just discovered is a sign of global warming. They argue the two species mating is due to climate change. Just about every phenomenon in nature is being explained by climate change. More snow is due to climate change. Less snow is due to climate change. More wildfires are due to climate change. Fewer fires are due to climate change. You will find lots of contradictory examples all attributed to climate change. So when it comes to sharks, many of these claims sound less like science and more like science fiction. Sometimes the claims sound more like the science fiction disaster movies like Sharknado. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Rod Dreher with us as we talk about his book, Live Not by Lies, and it is a book published by Sentinel. About 230 pages, 10 chapters, and a conclusion. But one of those chapters, Rod, is Father Kolakovic, you call the prophet. Now, some of the names would be more familiar to our listeners, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, for example. I doubt very many of us would know who this individual is, but you actually start your book by telling his story. Why so?
Yeah, that's right. I didn't know who he was until I ended up in Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, doing research for this book. Father Tomislav Kolakovic was a Jesuit priest working in Croatia, his homeland, in 1943, doing work to fight the Nazis. He got a tip one day that the Gestapo was coming for him, so he escaped into his mother's homeland, Slovakia, and took a job teaching at a Catholic university there. He told all his students, and this was 1943, he said, the good news is the Germans are going to lose this war. The bad news is the Soviets are going to be ruling this country when it's all said and done. And the first thing the communists are going to do is come after the church when they take over. So we've got to get ready for it. Now, his bishops warned him that he was being too alarmist and maybe trying to rile people up. But Father Kolakovic had studied the Soviet Union to do missionary work there, and he understood the communist mindset. So he kept at it. He would organize, Kerby, these prayer groups of 10, 15 students. They would come together to pray, to study Scripture, to talk about what was happening in their country, and to prepare the resistance. They spread this network of students all across the country. And sure enough, when the Iron Curtain came down, the first thing the communists did was go after Christians. But Father Kolakovic's network became the backbone of the underground church for 40 years. They were the resistance. So thank God that man was farsighted and didn't listen to the bishops who told him you're being too alarmist. I dedicate the book to him, even though I'm not a Catholic, because we need that kind of farsighted, prophetic, and courageous Christian leadership in this country today, as we're facing what people who grew up under communism tell me is soft totalitarianism coming to this country.
Well, and again, we've occasionally addressed this. I've talked with a pastor, too, who says I may have to prepare people for persecution. We've talked with you and a few others that have certainly talked about the idea that we certainly have dark clouds on the horizon. But one of the things we can learn from these individuals, and this gets you into your next chapter, how to see totalitarianism coming. And I'll mention all of them. You can pick out one or two that you thought were interesting, but loneliness and social atomization. Interestingly enough, that was my Viewpoints commentary yesterday on loneliness. Losing faith in hierarchies and institutions. The desire to transgress and destroy. Boy, we've seen that on the streets. Propaganda and the willingness to believe useful lies. A mania for ideology. A society that values loyalty more than expertise. Those were examples in the past, and obviously the past isn't always a prologue for the future, but oftentimes what has happened in the past can give you a preview of what might happen in the future. And you obviously see some real parallels from what happened when the Iron Curtain came down, when all of a sudden totalitarianism spread from not only Russia, but in the Eastern Bloc countries. And you see some of the same patterns today, don't you?
Absolutely. The ones that you listed at the top of your comment were all things that the great scholar of totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt, said in her 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, were present in both Germany and Russia before each of those countries fell to two very different kinds of totalitarianism. And basically, her point is that a society in which people are suffering, in which people are very lonely, there's an absence of social trust. They don't trust the church. They don't trust any of the institutions that had given them guidance throughout their lives. They become sitting ducks. They become sitting ducks for ideologues that give them a sense of solidarity, a sense of purpose, and a sense of meaning. That's exactly what the Bolsheviks did and what the Nazis did in Germany. It was so eerie to me, Kerby, to do research on the history of the Russian Revolution and to realize that the Marxists, the Bolsheviks, they didn't get any kind of real hearing with the middle classes in Russia until the late 19th century, when there was a terrific famine there. The imperial government failed to deal with the famine, and that caused a lot of ordinary middle-class people who had no time for the Bolsheviks before to decide they could give them a listen. And once the Bolsheviks took over the elite networks, that was the end. And one of the big lessons from the Russian Revolution for us is that it doesn't take a whole large group of the masses to have a revolution. All you need to do is gain control of the elites and gain their allegiance. And throughout elite networks and big business and universities, media, and so on, they will carry the revolution forward. I think we're seeing that happen in this country with social justice. And in many ways, these social justice warriors are a lot like the Bolsheviks.
Yes. Let me talk about that for just a minute, and then we'll get to another chapter on progressivism as religion, because you end one of the chapters by saying something we have talked about around this table before. You say social justice warriors and their theorists of their cause are not normal people who live by common sense. It relates to something we quoted recently. Matter of fact, we've had Dennis Prager in studio and also by phone, in which he said, I have to admit a mistake. I used to say that people on the left had a broken moral compass. And he says, I was wrong, because in order to have a broken moral compass, you have to have a compass. And he said, the reality is the left does not even have a moral compass. And he says, I'm not saying that necessarily as an attack, but just an observation. We, I think, Rod, so often assume that the people on the other side of an issue, on the other side of the table, on the other side of the aisle, on the other side of a social media platform, think the way we do and have the same kind of rules and the same kind of worldview that we do, or that maybe it's a little different. Maybe we agree on the goals but not the means, and so we just maybe disagree about the means. The reality is a lot of the people you're talking about here whether it was the Bolsheviks back in Russia, whether it's the social justice warriors today that are in the various areas of the academy and media, they're really not like the Christian people that you find yourself speaking to sometimes in a church or in a gathering.
No, not at all. And they're not like the old-fashioned liberals that you and I grew up being friends with and being taught by, things like that. In fact, the old-fashioned liberals, those who may have been on the left, but they still believed in things like free speech, and freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, all the things that we took for granted as part of American life. Those people became the gatekeepers in American institutions, and they're the ones who are collapsing now in the face of this attack by the militant young leftist. And it's happening everywhere. We have to realize that these progressives today, these young Jacobins, these young Bolsheviks, they do not feel as liberals do. I mean, classical liberals, whether you're a liberal of the left or the right, they don't feel that there's a need to be fair. They think fairness is a tool that oppressors use to oppress victims. And they believe we're in a war for progress, and that to be fair and tolerant of people who are evil, that is to say the oppressor classes, white male, heterosexual, Christian, that sort of thing, to be tolerant of them is to surrender to evil. So we have to understand, all of us here, whether we are secular liberals or conservative Christians, we have to understand that that's how they see things. And they are militant, they are zealous, they are absolutely committed to this ideology, and they will not stop until they crush us.
Very similar to the conversation we had a while back with Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. It is us versus them. It isn't that the other side is wrong. It's that the other side is evil, and as a result does not deserve a fair hearing. Your classic liberal, and we still have individuals like that on this program, will say, look, I may disagree with you, but I certainly support your right to articulate that view, even though I may disagree with it, even passionately. The left says, no, you don't even have a right to that view. You don't have the right to, in the example we used just a few minutes ago, express that at Facebook or Twitter or even on the college campus. So we're going to come back and answer another question, because how does this affect the church? In some respects, progressivism has become, if you will, religion. But we've also talked about how in some respects, when we've looked at what happened in Germany, what happened in Russia, and use those examples, what could happen here as well. And that relates to some of the other conversations we've had. So if you find yourself saying, this is something I'd like to know more about. I was out on Facebook last night and noticed somebody had a cover of Rod Dreher's book and said, this is the next book I'm going to read. Of course, I had it in my hands already. But again, Live Not by Lies, a Manual for Christian Dissidents. It is published by Sentinel. You can certainly find it in your local bookstore. I know you will, but we've also made it very easy for you to order it, both in hardback and Kindle. And so you can go right now and get a copy of it there. And we will continue our conversation with Rod Dreher right after this.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Rod Dreher with us for a little bit longer as we talk about this excellent book, Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents. We have information about it on our website. I'm going to do a commentary or two on the book, so certainly you can tell that I think it is significant. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to get a copy, you perhaps can find it in your local bookstore, but we also, as we always do, make it available to you so you can click on it and get it both in hardback and Kindle. Rod, let's, if we can, talk about religion in two ways. Number one, chapter 3 talks about progressivism as religion, and I used to buy into the argument, and I've changed my mind, that people that have religion have faith, people that don't, or that religion is one thing, but lack of religion is another. But what actually people do is they have to have some faith commitment, so oftentimes this progressive ideology becomes religion. And, of course, you talk about how that has become kind of a cult of social justice and those kinds of things and kind of the march to institutions. So that's the first issue. But then also, some of these individuals that lived under totalitarianism warned that the church itself would be taken over by some of these forces. So let's see if we can, for a few minutes, maybe talk about this idea of religion in both ways. What, in some respects, how non-religion has become a religion, and also then even how people that have religious commitments, if they're not careful, will see themselves capitulating to this kind of soft totalitarianism.
Well, the one thing that really opened my eyes up is in doing research about the Russian Revolution was to read this Russian-American historian named Yuri Slezkin. He had a great book called The House of Government that came out a couple of years ago about the Russian Revolution. And he said that the Bolshevik Party, that's the revolutionary party that brought about communism, that he described it as an apocalyptic millenarian political cult. In other words, they had all the same sociological marks as a millenarian cult. They believed that the world was headed towards a violent cataclysm in which the evil would be destroyed, evil people would be destroyed, then they would establish heaven on earth. The Bolsheviks believed that with religious zealotry, though they had no particular religion themselves. Mm-hmm. And it was their willingness to suffer to see their vision enacted that gave them such force. I mean, to read the history of what these people did and how they suffered in Siberia when the Tsar sent them away, it's really kind of impressive, especially when you think that there's so few Christians who would be willing to suffer for our Lord in the same way today. But if we look to progressives today, our own progressives, our social justice warriors, they too have effectively a religious view about progress. They believe that mankind is heading more and more towards a greater and greater progressive future, which they define as being liberated from anything that gets in the way of the individual will. And they believe that we have to keep throwing off any sexual boundaries. We have to throw away religion because that keeps us from exercising our individual will. We have to throw away our connection to families and so on and so forth. This can only be tyrannical ultimately. But they see this as being the way to utopia. And if we don't understand them as having as much zealotry as a fanatical religious cult, we're going to completely miss what they're really about.
And I think a good illustration, as you point out, is just all the different elements of it as well. But that also leads to the other one, because you point out that the term social justice oftentimes has been associated with Christianity, especially more Catholicism. And so as a result, I am running into and seeing even on Facebook individuals, in one case an intern that used to even work here, and other Christians who are really into social justice. And I would want to make a distinction, I think you would as well, between social justice and biblical justice. But this idea of Christian social justice almost provides an entree into the churches, doesn't it?
It does. The term social justice was invented in the 19th century by a Catholic priest, and what he meant by that was biblical justice. But everybody was Christian back then, or most people were Christian, so he didn't have to make that distinction. For a Christian, a socially just society is one that makes it easier for people to be virtuous, according to what Scripture teaches us is virtue. But for the social justice warriors, it's very different. Their idea of social justice is about bringing the powerful down and raising up the people that they consider to be oppressed. The thinker René Girard, he died a few years ago, but he was one of the great intellectuals of the 20th century. And Girard said that this new emerging totalitarianism was something of the Antichrist. And what he meant by that was the Antichrist, when he comes, he's going to be more Christian than Christ. That will be his deception.
Mm-hmm.
Girard said, when you see some of these social justice warriors, he didn't use the term, it didn't exist then, but that's what he was talking about. Girard said they're trying to care more for the victims than even Jesus did, and this fanaticism is turning into, Girard said, totalitarianism. And the ones that they're going to target, most of all, are the Christians, the ones who stand for what Christ really meant. Now, I agree with you. I've seen people, too, fall in for social justice believers because they have a heart for the poor. They have a heart for those who have suffered from racism, and all of us should. But we have to keep in mind that just because somebody has been victimized historically doesn't mean that they're automatically right about everything. And what worries me so much about the social justice in the secular sense is rather than look at each individual heart to see if there is right or wrong there, guilt or innocence, they draw the lines not down the middle of each human heart, but between groups. The
Yes.
Bolsheviks did it between social classes,
Mm-hmm.
but our social justice warriors do it between the races, between heterosexual and homosexual, and so on and so forth. That is the way to civil war.
It is. And of course, as we've pointed out, Marx was really making a distinction economically between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. But now when you have this intersectionality and all this different kind of racial issues, then it's between the oppressor and the victim, and provides an opportunity there to actually divide us in very significant ways. I could certainly camp out on this, but I thought we'd move on to some others because you have a whole section on capitalism and what you call the rise of woke capitalism. We've used a few examples in that, or even the what you call surveillance capitalism. But moving from religion to the economic issue and the idea of free market and capitalism, you're seeing that that's being changed and is morphed into something that might be unrecognizable to an Adam Smith or other advocates of the free market, right?
Yeah, and this is one of the key points that older conservatives of my generation, I'm 53, and older people who grew up under Ronald Reagan, revering Ronald Reagan, we just can't get this because capitalism has changed so much in the last 10, 20 years. A very key moment in the culture war, Kerby, happened back in 2015 when the state of Indiana tried to pass and did pass a state version of the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, just to give religious believers a little more of an equal playing field. They were taken into court for discrimination, and a discrimination lawsuit. Well, what happened when the state passed that and Governor Mike Pence signed it? Major corporations, multinationals like Apple Computer, Salesforce, and a bunch of others came down like a ton of bricks on the state of Indiana. They accused them of being bigoted against LGBTs and said, if you don't repeal that, there will be major economic consequences. And of course, the state backed down. That was the first time that major corporations had involved themselves in that way in the culture war, and it was decisive. We have seen big business be the main pushers, the main advocates for progressive social policies. And in a free market democracy like ours, that gives them immense power. And I think that we as Christians and as conservatives have to take a second look, a hard second look, at the way the market works, because we're seeing happen all over in these companies the spread of wokeness. Halliburton, of all companies, Dick Cheney's old company, it brought in somebody to teach critical race theory to the executives recently.
Yes.
This is happening everywhere. And if you don't sign on to this sort of thing, you are not going to be able to keep your job. When I was in Poland doing research for my book, I talked to some Polish Catholics who worked for the Polish branch of Western European and American multinationals, and they were being compelled in the workplace to participate in LGBT pride celebrations. They said, look, we're Catholic Christians. This is against our conscience, but we've got to feed our families, and there aren't many good jobs here. Well, this is cultural imperialism, but it's coming not through the government, but through big business.
Yes, it is. Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the second part of the book, How to Live in Truth. And again, some of that certainly, once again, reprises some of the material that Rod Dreher has written about before in the Benedict option, but we'll spend just a few more minutes in that regard. And if you just joined us again, we're talking about this book, Live Not by Lies, a Manual for Christian Dissidents. It came out in late September, and we wanted you to know as much about it, and that's why we're doing this hour-long interview with Rod Dreher. We'll continue with him right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue conversation with Rod Dreher for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Live Not by Lies, a Manual for Christian Dissidents. And in this next section, which is so very well written, you really give us the story of a lot of individuals. Now, we may know the name of Alexander Solzhenitsyn or Richard Wurmbrand, but most of these are people that I would suspect most of us have never heard of. But in some respects, they really give us a pattern, maybe even a model for how we live if indeed we find ourselves in this same kind of circumstances. Maybe it's soft totalitarianism rather than the harsh totalitarianism that they face. But it helps us understand that we should value truth. We should cultivate a cultural memory. if nothing else, recognize the importance of family and religion. Tell us a little bit more, if you might.
You know, Kerby, when I went over there, I was in Slovakia, and a Slovak Catholic priest said, in some ways it's more difficult today than it was under communism, because under communism, the light of the gospel shone clearly through that darkness. But today, when the light of the gospel shines into this world, it hits nothing but fog. So they are well aware over there, the Christians who endured communism, that they too are facing a threat like they've never experienced. But they at least have enough memory of what they had to do, how they had to prepare themselves spiritually and in their communities and in their families to resist. And one of the most important things they did was they refused self-pity. I tell the story in the book about Dr. Sylvester Kuchmeri. He was a young Christian physician who was thrown in prison for his Christianity in 1951 by the communists. When they took him off the street, the secret police, he laughed. And he says that he laughed because he knew that he was about to suffer for Christ. Mm-hmm. And he said there can be no greater gift to a Christian than to be able to share in our Lord's sufferings. And that mentality got him through. They tortured him. They kept him in prison for 13 years on false charges. But he talked about how he knew that he could never pity himself because everything would collapse. Instead, he used suffering as a chance to deepen his conversion, to deepen his sanctification, to preach to others in prison, and to help others. That's one thing we all have to do. And one of the things I heard from every single person was that we Americans have got to get used to the idea of suffering. We have been so comfortable as Christians for so long in this country, and a lot of us have fallen into thinking about the Christian walk as being one of middle-class comfort and security. It's not going to be that anymore, not for us. And if we insist on living in middle-class comfort and security, we're going to surrender. We're going to burn that pinch of incense to Caesar to protect ourselves. All these Christians over there, whether they were Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, every one of them knew that to stand in truth, even if you had to suffer for it, was the only thing that would save them, to be willing to suffer for the Lord. And I have so many stories in this book. It just knocked me out to think that these people, these aren't martyrs and confessors from the history books. They are living, breathing people you can meet today. The man in Russia, Alexander Ogorodnikov, sitting in a hotel lobby in Moscow, his face partially paralyzed with the beatings he took in prison, and him crying, talking about how an angel came to him one night in prison and explained to him why the Lord had allowed this to happen to him. It was a believer. It was so he could witness to condemned men in prison who were going to be shot by the Soviets, but because he was there to witness for them, the Lord used his suffering, Ogorodnikov's suffering, to lead them to Christ. I mean, incredible stories, and we have got to make those stories part of our own memory as members of the body of Christ, and to realize that if they could do that, so can we, and we have to do it.
You know, in your chapter on suffering, you talk about being in Budapest. And of course, I go there every year to teach a Word of Life in Budapest. And you may be well aware of that museum there that talks about torture and persecution. Of course, we've on many occasions talked about Pastor Richard Wurmbrand and a variety of others. So in some respects, we do have those who have come before us as a model. But there is a sense in which this book is really a reminder that this needs to be not only talked about here on Point of View, which we did today, and we'll even rebroadcast this again to give it as much exposure as possible, but it also needs to be addressed from the pulpits of America. And I mentioned earlier that some people, Erwin Lutzer and others, said, you know, as a pastor, I felt maybe I had to prepare the country and the congregation for the persecution and really the possibility that we may face suffering. So what would you say to pastors just before we close? Because it seems to me that pastors and Christian leaders need to be addressing this issue as well. And I know that you wrote the book for anyone, but especially for them to take these ideas and these stories and to pass them on to those under their particular spiritual care.
Thank you so much for asking me that. I would say to every pastor listening to this and every lay leader in a congregation, wake up. The time is short. The warning that these believers who suffered under communism are sending us is loud, and we have to pay attention to it, and we have to prepare ourselves while there is time. The Lord said that the gates of hell will not prevail against his church, but he didn't say that it wouldn't prevail against his church in the United States. We are going through a time of testing, and those who have not prepared themselves will not make it. That could not be more clear. So read this book, get more deeply into the work of people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and talk with your congregations about it. I put together a Kerby study guide that you can find on my website, theamericanconservative.com/Dreher, a free downloadable study guide for discussion within churches and Sunday schools about the challenges facing us. We have to figure it out together.
And again, I was just going to come to that because it does seem to me that some people might say, well, you got some great material there, but what else can I do with it? And certainly the way you've written it, I think people could read through each chapter and come up with that. But since you have an actual study guide, that's another resource that you can find as well. And again, that's at the American Conservative website. So, Rod Dreher, I just appreciate this. And in some respects, this is a perfect sequel to what you wrote about years ago, and we've interviewed you on the Benedict option, because we have to understand that the culture isn't necessarily going in a direction that all of us would want. It's certainly not going in a direction that's going to actually revere and value Christian convictions. And it's not the first time that Christians have had to see the dark clouds on the horizon and begin to prepare for that, which is one of the reasons why you start your particular first chapter out with Father Kolakovic. And so that is why I think this book comes together in a way that really provides an opportunity to plan for the future. And after all, Isaiah 32:8 says, the noble man devises noble plans, and by noble plans he stands. And of course, in Proverbs it talks about the mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. So if you want to plan for the future and you want to have a manual for Christian dissidents, that's why this book by Rod Dreher, Live Not by Lies, is a very good book. So, Rob, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
It was a pleasure to be here, and let's not forget what Solzhenitsyn said. The greatest mistake we in the West can make is assuming that what happened in Russia can't happen here. It can happen here, and it's time for us Christians to get ready for it.
Again, that's why we wanted you to know about the book. We have information about Rod Dreher on the website. Of course, you can also go to the American Conservative website, find some of that. If you click on the button of the picture of the book, you can find it available in hardcover and Kindle. I'm pretty sure you'll be able to find it in most of your bookstores, but I know, again, many of you might not be near a bookstore, or they may not have a book that is very overtly Christian, or one that maybe is slightly more academic. All this is very readable because it's just full of great stories. So I think you're going to really appreciate this book. And so again, if you'd like to get some more information, either about Rod Dreher, about the book, Live Not by Lies, you can go to the website, pointofview.net. Click on that button that says See More, and we have lots of information for you so that you can take advantage of this and really kind of plan for the future. It's a story that we need to promote more often, especially in light of what might be taking place in our elections. Let's take a break, and you've been listening to Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees, and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. These next 2 hours, we're going to be getting into a lot of different topics. And originally, my plan was to spend some time talking about what we've learned so far in terms of the confirmation hearings with Amy Coney Barrett. And we will get to that in just a few minutes. But a lot of what I'm going to say, at least in this first segment, has to do with this issue of social media. Those of you that ever watch online, you'll notice right now I'm holding up our booklet on social media. It's one we've made available for our donors. I've said before that some of these booklets we have to update almost immediately. Social media, certainly the ones on anti-defamation as well as anti-Semitism and a variety of others need to be updated, and especially this one on social media, because we have a perfect example, maybe the significant watershed example of how biased now Facebook and Twitter and other social media have become in the midst of a campaign. Let me try to give you some background. And that is on Wednesday morning, that's yesterday, the New York Post published a blockbuster story. Now, you can consider this an October surprise or just something that they finally had all the information for, but they have the emails, documents, and photographs which detail, in an incredible amount of detail, by the way, I might say, the efforts of the Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, to sell his father's influence to those in various countries. In particular, we'll talk about Ukraine, but we can get into all of those. And interestingly enough, this was certainly a very important story. But what you started seeing happen was first Facebook and then Twitter said, we're just not going to allow people to even read the story. We're not going to allow people to post the story. And we're going to lock up some of these people's social media accounts. One of the accounts, by the way, that was locked up, well, that would be the White House press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, simply because she, and of course a number of others, retweeted the story when it came out. So this is a step much further beyond some of those minor examples I've used in our booklet on social media. So let me, if I can, read first from National Review, then I'm going to read from The Federalist and a couple of others. We may want to post these later, but you will see almost everybody now that looks at this that isn't maybe in the pocket of social media writing about this. So I'm just picking two examples to educate you on something that maybe the mainstream press will ignore. I'm hoping not. I think this is one step further, or to use one of those trite phrases, a bridge too far. We'll see where it is. But anyway, reading from the editors of National Review, they said this morning, and they're talking about yesterday, Andy Stone, Facebook's policy communications manager. Then they put in parentheses, as per his bio, a former staffer for Senator Barbara Boxer of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, the House Majority PAC, and all that. So first of all, let's just recognize that somebody who is actually doing policy communication for Facebook actually worked for Senator Barbara Boxer in California when she was a senator. Anyway, Andy Stone announced that the social media giant would begin reducing the distribution of a New York Post investigation into emails purporting that Joe Biden met with a top executive from the Ukrainian natural gas firm Burisma Holdings at the behest of his son, Hunter Biden. This has implications not only Hunter Biden, but of course to the former vice president. But anyway, one of the emails purported by the Post, a Burisma executive thanks Hunter for inviting him to Washington to meet with the vice president in 2015. Now, to be fair, the editors of National Review say, look, if the Post report is to be believed, the Biden-Burisma meeting occurred less than a year before the vice president pressured Ukrainian officials to fire the prosecutor investigating the company that was paying Hunter Biden, remember this, $50,000 a month, $50,000 a month for his alleged expertise, which, by the way, as far as we can determine, was zero. That is, by any journalistic standards, they say, newsworthy. Yes, it is. That's why the New York Post ran with it. Now, you might say, well, it might not be a true story. Okay, we will get to that in just a minute because there have been a lot of stories that have been run on Twitter and Facebook which even at the time people knew were false, but they were not pulled and they were not censored. So let's put this in some kind of context for at least a few minutes. But again, I appreciate the editors of National Review put it this way. Is this newsworthy? Yes. Okay. But instead of simply asking pertinent questions or trying to debunk the reporting by the Post, the media blackout instead was initiated. A number of well-known journalists warned colleagues and their sizable social media audiences not to share the story. Okay, that happens sometimes. By the afternoon, Twitter had joined Facebook in suppressing the article, not only barring its users from sharing it with others. If you try to take that article and share it right now, you might not be able to do so, but also barring them from sharing it through direct messages as well. This is getting a little bit more oppressive than you've ever seen before in terms of censorship. And as I pointed out, then it goes on to point out that it locked the accounts of White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany. It locked out, are you ready for this? It locked out the account for the New York Post and also locked out the account of anybody that dared retweet the story. Recently, I've just had an interview with Rod Dreher, which he talks about soft totalitarianism. That's kind of what this is. It may not be from the government. It's just simply from these private entities that are making sure that this story gets very little coverage. Do you think that some people tonight on some of the Talking Head shows will be talking about it? Yes, and I would encourage you to go and see which Talking Head shows, the various evening news shows, talk about this and the ones that simply ignore this. And that will tell you a lot about the fairness of coverage, because if indeed it's a false story, it's always a possibility. Doesn't look likely since they got the emails and everything. It's a really tough one indeed. But nevertheless, not once, of course, in the previous situations, since we've had the concern about possibly faulty information on a story, has either Facebook or Twitter concerned itself with the sourcing methods of reporters. Not once did it censor any of those pieces. As a matter of fact, Twitter initially cited what's called its hacked materials policy and a lack of authoritative reporting as a justification for censoring this story. But nevertheless, we are certainly having to recognize that really this came from looking at the hard drive that was in a repair shop. And of course, the fact is, much of that information has been known and is now brought forward. And if indeed that is the problem, because it was, quote, hacked, I would just put on the table before we take a break, what about the New York Times publishing Donald Trump's tax returns, which, if anything, probably were available because someone actually broke the law. So, nevertheless, I'm going to get into a little bit more aspect of this because I think this may be one of those times when maybe social media has gone too far. And the next couple of days, we'll see whether or not people really want to begin to deal with what actually has happened from Facebook and Twitter. But we need to cover that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
One of the criticisms of the claims of human-caused climate change is that the theory predicts everything. Now, you might think that makes it a good theory. Actually, when you have a theory that predicts everything and cannot be falsified, that makes it a bad theory. In fact, it's easy to find examples of contradictory claims all being attributed to climate change. But let me give you one example. Sharks fascinate us, probably going back decades to the movie Jaws. We seem fascinated by them as illustrated by the popularity of Shark Week on television. So what do scientists predict about sharks and climate change? One article from a few years ago in The Guardian explains that the surge in fatal shark attacks is blamed on global warming. The article does acknowledge that some of the increase may also be due to human activity and the abundance of seals, but the primary reason for the surge in attacks is climate change. A more recent article in The Independent predicts that global warming could actually make sharks smaller and less aggressive. The argument is that warmer waters and increased CO2 could make it more difficult for sharks to catch prey. A third article comes from scientists in Australia who believe that a new hybrid shark just discovered is a sign of global warming. They argue the two species mating is due to climate change. Just about every phenomenon in nature is being explained by climate change. More snow is due to climate change. Less snow is due to climate change. More wildfires are due to climate change. Fewer fires are due to climate change. You will find lots of contradictory examples all attributed to climate change. So when it comes to sharks, many of these claims sound less like science and more like science fiction. Sometimes the claims sound more like the science fiction disaster movies like Sharknado. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me open up the phones because I love to get your thoughts about this. For some time, many of you have said, well, why do we even rely on social media? And maybe we should not. And some people have wanted to go to other alternatives, Parler and others. And why can't we create our own website? And why can't we create our own platforms? And there's all sorts of really good questions. So I'd love to get your thoughts about this. But again, if you just joined us, we're talking about what happened yesterday when the New York Post published a story which has emails, documents, photographs, all the rest, detailing the efforts of the presidential candidate, Joe Biden's son, Hunter, to Biden to actually sell his father's influence. And the fact is that almost immediately, first Facebook and then very quickly Twitter decided they wanted to suppress that article and would not allow people to post it or even to pass it on, and they locked the accounts. I'm assuming they've unlocked them now, but I could be wrong, of the White House press secretary, the New York Post, and a variety of others. Maybe if you saw the article and tried to pass it on and your system was locked up, maybe you can give us a story as well about what happened to you. Now, the argument from Twitter was originally that this actually violated what they called hacked materials policy and a lack of any kind of authoritative reporting. And that was kind of their justification for censoring the New York Post article. Now, think about this. It's one of the most widely read newspapers in one of the largest states and cities, largest state and the largest city in the country. So think that through for just a minute. And though the reliability of the story, of course, still needs to be fact-checked and determined and all of that, Twitter offered really no evidence, according to the editors of National Review, that the information was obtained illegally. By the way, no similar standard, they point out, was applied when the New York Times published Donald Trump's tax returns, even though anyone who had legal access to them probably broke the law in sharing those with the New York Times. And that's a story for another day, but I just thought I'd mention that in passing. Now, you might say, okay, how did the newspaper get these if they didn't hack them? Well, it turned out that they were in a hard drive on a laptop that had been dropped off at a repair shop, and that actually the FBI is in possession of this hard drive. But nevertheless, it's all public record now. And so you can certainly see that if you want to have a fair and honest evaluation of the story, then it certainly seems to me that an independent press would want to debate and investigate and fact-check the information. And certainly if the roles were reversed and we found that one of the sons of Donald Trump was actually, if you will, selling access to the president, to a foreign government, and we had evidence of that, just, try to say to me with a straight face that, oh, no, the New York Times would never cover that. Of course they would. And so it is only because it is someone that they hope will be the next president of the United States that there has been a complete clamping down of the attempt to even evaluate the story. And again, I'm not necessarily vouching for its truthfulness, but the more evidence that they have, the less likely it is to be questionable. Which brings me to another piece that I thought I would read from as well, and then we're going to move on. The two co-founders of the Federalists, that would be Ben Domenech and Sean Davis, put together a piece in which they said every Republican lawmaker must condemn big tech's election interference. And they said that the actions by Facebook and Twitter represent, they say, nothing less than a brazen attempt at corrupt big tech partisans who intend to steal the election from the American people. Okay, it's a little bit strong, but nevertheless, I see what they're talking about, and that is this is a very important and valuable study and report from the New York Post. And it is one that is backed up with emails, documents, and photographs. And instead of wanting to post it, but say we have questions about the authenticity of that, which I still think would be pretty heavy-handed, instead the media giants, Facebook and Twitter, just simply said, no, we're going to just throttle it down and prevent anybody from seeing it as well. So they go into some of the various arguments that you can possibly make at that point. But again, remind us that this came from Andy Stone. Remember that he actually worked as both a congressional staffer and campaign staffer for Senator Barbara Boxer, and then earlier for even Senator John Kerry. So again, just reverse all of those and have some of these being prevented from being covered by somebody who had worked for John McCain or Mitt Romney, who also was preventing the publication of a story. You can see how that would be seen as somewhat scandalous, of course. But let me go back to the argument being made here in the Federalist, because they said, as of this moment, every American voter is currently banned from linking to news reported by one of the largest papers in one of the largest states in the country, in the largest city in the country. Okay, think that through for a minute. Even the New York Post primary Twitter account has been locked, they point out. They claim the Hunter Biden stories violate the rules against distribution of hacked material. Of course, we talked about that before. Something that apparently didn't matter, regarding President Trump's illegally obtained tax returns. Twitter users can't even direct message the story. That's how much the CEO, Jack Dorsey, doesn't want you to know what's in it. And so you can certainly say, oh, well, maybe it's just a mistake of the algorithm and accidentally censored the story. That's a possibility, but again, that almost doesn't pass the straight face test. And so that is certainly one of those issues. And if nothing else, brings us to the punchline for these articles. And that is after talking about whether or not the Supreme Court might start reevaluating some of the various laws associated with social media, because it is a private company. Got that? Both of them are private companies. They went on to say then America's elected Republicans should not wait for the court because that has to do with Section 230 in the particular law. But they say if Silicon Valley insists, in the vein of George Orwell's unfortunately prophetic book, on enforcing newspeak guidelines regardless of their relation to reality, thereby declaring openly partisan war against America's news consumers, then the elected officials of the only major political party left in America that still believes in and defends the First Amendment needs to declare war back. They go on to say that for years, big tech did nothing to stop the vicious and false Russian collusion hoax, which was perpetrated on the American people by, of course, now we know a lot more, the Russian agent Christopher Steele, suspected Russian spy, and some of the others. For years, big tech has had no problem with foreign election meddling, using their platforms to cripple the American presidency. And if you have not seen Social Dilemma, I guess it's going to be harder to see since it was always on some of the platforms that people don't want to go to anymore. But nevertheless, that reminds you of what has happened there. And they also point out that big tech was fine with the various Ukrainian leaders using illegal links and fake news to attempt the literal overthrow and ouster of the U.S. president. And instead, they expressed their deep concern about the influence of some of the means endorsing Donald Trump. So, again, they claim that big tech will claim that they treat all information the same, and they would never put their thumbs on the scale in favor of one party or ideological movement over another. But nevertheless, you can see what we have. So they end by saying enough is enough. Lawmakers can stand by and watch big tech steamroll information in an un-American attempt to manipulate our elections while muzzling hundreds of millions of Americans, or they can stand up and drive a spoke in the wheel. So we'll see where this goes. But nevertheless, it has been something that has got a lot more attention than it even did yesterday, if for no other reason, when you start talking about a story that, again, we can't vouch for its authenticity other than to point out there seems to be a lot of data there, and it is certainly something that's part of the public record. The real issue almost isn't now the Hunter Biden story, although that might have consequences for the election. I don't know. We almost have, 17 million people have already voted, so these kinds of stories maybe not even having that kind of impact. Anyway, the bigger story is the fact that in the midst of this, first Facebook and then Twitter said, you don't have a right to even know about this, and if you even dare to try to pass this story on or to tweet it to someone else or to post it, we're going to actually prohibit you from doing that. And by doing that, we might even lock out your account. When they locked out the White House press secretary and locked out the account for the New York Post, they may have gone just a little too far, but we'll see. And that's why I wanted to cover this in some detail. But when we come back from the break, we're going to spend some time talking about what I originally planned. That is, have we learned anything from the confirmation hearings? And I think we have. We'll talk about that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, let's open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212. What did you learn from the confirmation hearings with Amy Coney Barrett? The first article I've posted here is called The Goat Rodeo. It's by Kevin Williamson. It's intended to kind of make you smile a little bit, but also just to talk about the fact that there are some really crazy things that have already happened as a result of this confirmation hearing. So I want to talk about that. Then a very good piece that appeared in First Things, and maybe even some other comments about the confirmation hearings. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's talk about the ugly first, and some of the bad. I guess they all kind of run together. And that is, Kevin Williamson says the Amy Coney Barrett hearings have been kind of a goat rodeo that gives goat rodeos a bad name. Okay, I love that one. And he gives us some of the lowlifes. And the low lights, probably a better way to say it. First of all, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, who is from Rhode Island, came out. He says, full-blown conspiracy kook, briefly converting the chamber into a room full of crazy. Senator Ben Sass, who's kind of one of my heroes, called it beautiful mind conspiracy charts. Now, again, that probably flew over the heads of half of the senators that probably don't even know the movie Beautiful Mind and all the rest. But nevertheless, you should hopefully have caught that, because it was, as he says, and again, I'm quoting from Kevin Williamson for a minute, this hilariously stupid connect-the-dots nonsense argument that the reptilian shapeshifters and Illuminati... so well written. Talking about Charles Koch and the Federalist Society are secretly buying federal court judgments behind the scenes. Gosh, we haven't had anybody talk about the Koch brothers in a long time. And one of the things I've said is, I'm not necessarily one of those people that travels in every conspiracy meeting or any conservative meeting or any of those kinds of things. But I've never met either of the Koch brothers in any event I've ever been in. So if they are so nefarious and behind the scenes funding all of this, they really are behind the scenes, because I've never met them and I don't know anybody that has. So that's the first thing. Then the Federalist Society, oh, please. These are individuals made up of people like Chelsea Ullman and Kelly Shackelford and Jeremy Dice and Lathan Watch, the kind of people we have on the program every day. So again, it's just kind of this idea that they're trying to buy the federal court, and it is an eye roller for sure. Well, Kevin Williamson goes on to point out then there was kind of this anti-Catholic conspiracy talked about in previous times, in which one of the individuals, not this one, Amy Coney Barrett, but others, was a member of the Knights of Columbus, and kind of in a classic McCarthyite, are you now or ever been style, must you swear an oath in order to join this organization? If so, what is that oath? And then goes on with some of the numbers, because at one point he makes a big deal about the number of times the Supreme Court is split 5-4. Never the mind that the 5-4 splits that have ratified same-sex marriage and even transgenderism, although that was actually a 6-3 one, went the way he probably would want them to. But he's all upset about some of these others that go 5-4 in the Republican way. And I just appreciate the fact that Kevin Williamson just quotes from somebody who I've respected in terms of just looking at some of the numbers, Dan McLaughlin, who points out really there's a major reason why these recent 5-4 partisan splits have gone the Republicans' way. That's because you've got 5 Republican appointees to the court and 4 Democratic appointees to the court. And in some cases, as we talked about just yesterday, Ben Shapiro ran the numbers, pointing out that the 4 vote in lockstep all the time. The 5 do not. And that has been true not even just in the last session, but all the way back to the 1980s, because you had individuals like Sandra Day O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy, David Souter, and then even more recently, John Roberts, who's the Chief Justice, voting in a way that isn't in lockstep with the others actually appointed by Republican presidents. So do you see the fallacy of the argument. But let's move on, because Kevin Williamson had a little more fun. This one, I just had to smile as well. Senator Chris Coons, he's from he's Democrat from Delaware, provided a moment of unintentional mirth, he says, when he demanded that Judge Amy Coney Barrett explain why she had singled out Chief Justice John Roberts in her writing about the majority opinion in the Affordable Care Act decision. Well, Justice Barrett very patiently explained there's a reason for that. The opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. And then you have some others that I will let you read at your enjoyment, because she quotes from Senator Richard Blumenthal on really taking some comment she made at a school event that could be twisted somehow to affect her view about firearms or the Second Amendment. But it's pretty just much common sense, because she had talked about the fact that there has been a long-standing practice of saying that those who pose a violence to society and community maybe shouldn't have firearms. And that does make sense, because she says that's kind of history consistent with common sense. So anyway, you can go through these long lists, and it's been kind of interesting to see some of the comments on the other side, because Senator Ted Cruz gets mentioned, Senator Ben Sasse gets mentioned, and a number of others. But nevertheless, at the end of this piece, and I'm going to move on to the next one by Kevin Williamson, he says, really, when you look at this whole thing, this isn't about Judge Barrett, really. Her nomination almost certainly is a lost cause for the Democrats, and delusional though they may be, they know it. But he says this goat rodeo underway in the Senate has shown the Democrats involved to be at least as bonkers and untrustworthy as the president. By the way, if you don't know, Kevin Williamson doesn't have a lot of respect for the president either, but he thought the president sometimes was flying off the handle until he saw some of the Democrats and some of the things they said. Okay. The bad and the ugly. How about the good? Let's go to a very good piece that appeared in First Things. It's our second article here, Why the Senate Should Confirm Judge Barrett. And that is Judge Amy Coney Barrett, President Trump's nominee to succeed the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, is appealing and appearing before the Senate this week. Her confirmation seems likely. And, of course, it has turned in, as we pointed out, to a very partisan and predictable affair. The argument being made here is that Judge Barrett is a well-regarded legal scholar with expertise in constitutional law and federal courts. Her reputation as a thoughtful member of the textualist school predates her current celebrity. As to her professional past, she's first in her class at the Notre Dame Law School, served as a clerk in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. Then on the court itself, for Justice Antonin Scalia, worked in private practice in a prominent D.C. court and firm, and spent many years, of course, as we know, on the faculty of Notre Dame. So then they take on a couple of the objections. One is an objection not to her, but to process, specifically to the fact that President Trump nominated Judge Barrett only weeks before a presidential election, and to the fact that the Senate Republicans refused to schedule a vote on the nomination of Judge Merrick Garland. And, of course, we've talked about that before. And I appreciate this writing by Mark Musian, because he says the critics have a point. And I've always said that even in the past. Yes, okay, Barack Obama had a right to propose Merrick Garland as a judge, and the Senate had a right to decide whether they were going to have those hearings or not. Frankly, there were a lot of people that were hoping behind the scenes that actually it would be possible for the Republicans not to hold hearings, because it gave them a campaign issue, and they fully intended that if indeed you had Hillary Clinton become the president, that she would put forward a much more liberal nominee than Judge Garland. And so in some respects, that is the case. So as they point out here, maybe hypocrisy is bipartisan, but, that's past. And whether they did the right thing or not, that is history. Another objection is that Judge Barrett will be an activist. And here they say the argument seems to be that as a faithful Catholic and a member of a various group, she will inevitably decide cases on the basis of her religious convictions rather than the law. But again, you go back to one of her speeches at the Hillsdale College, and when she said, when you think about the debate about whether someone's religion has any bearing on their fitness for office, it seems to me that the premise of the question is that people of faith would be uniquely and have a uniquely difficult time separating their moral commitments from their obligation to apply the law. But she goes on to say, people who have no faith, people who are not religious, also have deeply held moral convictions, and it's just important for those people as well to set aside their personal moral convictions and follow the law, which is what she said she would do. And quite frankly, you can make a much better case that the Republican appointees have moved all over the map based on the case, and those 4 liberal justices voted in lockstep all of the time. And so, if anything, I think there's been a good demonstration that some of these textualists actually look at the law, look at the Constitution, and sometimes render decisions that they don't necessarily always agree with because they follow the law. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes and the news, and then the next hour we're going to spend some time talking with Haydn Shaw. His new book out is Sticking Points, How to Get 5 Generations Working Together in the 12 Places They Come Apart. And I think you're going to enjoy this for 2 different reasons simultaneously. One, it really provides some great leadership and management skills, which is something I think all of us need. Second of all, it just reminds us of something we talk about sometimes here on Point of View. We're going to do another another one of those millennial roundtables coming up in about a week or two. I guess about 2 weeks from today. And that is because generations are very, very different. So we're going to look at the 5 generations of individuals and recognize that even within a generation, sometimes there are differences, but these cohorts do perceive the world differently. And so we're going to kind of work our way through some of that. So it's a reminder again, whether you are in a business and have people of different age that you're managing, whether you're in a church, and I would suspect most of you listening do go to a church, and you and your pastor and your leaders are trying to kind of figure out what works best for different generations, I think you're going to benefit tremendously from this book. So it works if you're in business. It works, of course, if you're in church. I think it also works because it helps you understand your generation. More importantly, maybe those other crazy generations that you have not figured out. So I think you're really going to enjoy that conversation. And it just gets us away from some of the insanity of the confirmation hearings and a number of other things. But I started out today talking just briefly about this story from the New York Post. And I was going to go a different direction, but I thought, I have this article that came out a few days ago by Kyle Smith. The kinds of questions people would ask Joe Biden if he's a Republican. And really what it is the questions that are never asked of this vice president that now, if they aren't asked in light of this New York Post article, show you even more the bias of the press. And again, I want you to have discernment. Don't trust everything I say. Check it out. That's why we post these articles. Don't trust what you read on the internet. Check it out as well. Don't trust just because you saw it on television. Check it out. And I think what you're going to find is these kinds of questions aren't going to be asked. Here was one that Kyle Smith said. Mr. Biden, at the presidential debate, you said of your son, Hunter Biden, my son did nothing wrong. Do you not understand that there is a blatant conflict involved with having a son on the board of a Ukrainian energy company who was seemingly paid for his connections to you at a time when you, according to the New York Magazine, were playing a central role in overseeing U.S. policy in Ukraine? So again, Hunter Biden's receiving what? $50,000 a month to be on the board of a Ukrainian energy company, while New Yorker Magazine talks about the fact and reports that Vice President Biden is overseeing U.S. policy in Ukraine. And then they ask, are you seriously arguing that Hunter Biden was hired by the Ukrainians and paid $3.4 million, when you add all that up, for his energy expertise, for which he had none, rather than as a backdoor way of influencing you and the United States towards Ukraine? And I can go through some of the other details associated with that, because some are now saying that Hunter Biden actually was paid $83,000 a month. $50,000, $83,000, what's $33,000 among friends? I mean, that's the other number that's starting to surface there. And just, again, it doesn't pass the straight face test, of course. So that's all about Ukraine. Let me take on one other issue real quickly, just to show you these are the reasonable questions that you would want to ask Joe Biden if we had a fair media. These are the kinds of questions certainly you would ask if he was a Republican, don't you think? Okay, here's one more. Mr. Biden, in December 2013, you took your son Hunter Biden with you on Air Force Two to China, where he promptly introduced you to a businessman by the name of Jonathan Lee. Lee's company later gave Hunter a 10% stake in an investment fund that now manages some $2 billion. A White House official you work with told The New Yorker the administration said it appeared that Hunter was leveraging access for his benefit, which just doesn't happen in that White House. Optics really mattered. How could you allow this to happen? That's their attempt to try to cover that. Here's another one. Mr. Biden, another Chinese businessman, a billionaire named Yi Jiaming, was partners with Hunter on a natural gas business in Louisiana and also gave Hunter a very large diamond. Yi's deputy was later arrested in New York on charges of bribing government officials, charges on which he was later convicted. His first call, according to the New York Times, was to your younger brother, Jimmy, that'd be Jimmy Biden, who also tried to reach Hunter. Do you think you are entitled to allow your family members to profit from your name and connections? And while we're mentioning Jimmy Biden, that's the brother of Joe Biden, Mr. Biden, while you were vice president in 2010, your brother Jimmy, who had no expertise in the construction industry, nevertheless formed a construction company that a few months later was granted a $1.5 billion contract to build housing in Iraq. Isn't that part of a long pattern of Biden family corruption? Well, again, we have talked in the past with people that have traced down some of these stories. I more recently was able to get a copy of the Trump card, which is done by Dinesh D'Souza, in which he does an interview with some individuals that have traced out all these various sweetheart relationships. And these are questions that I think any legitimate news organization should ask of the vice president. Don't you think? And the fact that those questions are not going to be asked, or certainly haven't been asked yet, is, I think, really important. And if indeed this New York Post story has any kind of legs, and it seems that it may, those are the questions you would expect the mainstream press to ask and to begin to try to get some answers for. So, if nothing else, just wanted to put that on the table as well. Let me come back to some of the news here. I mentioned it the other day, but the New York Times has really come back time and time again to say maybe things are really getting a little bit better. I quoted from Daniel McNeil the other day. He's the science and health reporter for the New York Times. He is an individual that has really been kind of doom and gloom. He called himself a doomsayer Cassandra. Pretty strong. But now he's saying experts are saying with genuine confidence that the coronavirus pandemic will be over far sooner than they expected. He actually begrudgingly gives credit to the Trump administration's effort to develop a vaccine through what is called what? Operation Warp Speed, and saying they are working with remarkable efficiency. And interestingly enough, of course, we've learned a lot more because one of the other parts of the article points out that we already have said this months ago, but let's say it again, that schools are not super spreaders of the coronavirus. Yes, there are some cases in which schools have had to maybe either postpone something. There have been some football games that have been postponed or canceled, but by and large, we certainly recognize that it is less likely that these young children are going to be spreading that as much as they were, and that they will seemingly have a great deal of immunity. And those few that do not need to be protected, and that's this idea of targeted protection that a lot of people have been talking about, something that, or sometimes it's called focus protection. And we talked about that the other day when I quoted from Dr. David Nabarro, who's one of the members of the World Health Organization. By the way, we are talking about censorship. A lot of the things that came out from the World Health Organization and Dr. David Nabarro, those were censored too. So pay attention to social media because they don't apparently want you to know all of the information coming out, even from the World Health Organization. Who would think? Let's take a break, though. I want to get to this very interesting book, Sticking Points, How 5 Generations Working Together in 12 Places Can Actually Be Effective. I think you'll learn a lot about the generations. You'll learn a lot about management and leadership. I think it'll just be a fun interview and just gets us away from some of the confirmation insanity. So we will cover that right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yeah, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today. Right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you listen to Point of View any length of time, you know how we talk about different generations. I've written books on the subject of the baby boom generation. We've talked about baby boom and baby bust. We've talked about millennials. Matter of fact, we do a millennial roundtable. Certainly, Chelsea Yeoman will be conducting another one of those very shortly. And then since then, we've also brought in an expert that talks about the so-called iGen generation. And so, as we so often do, we try to explain some of these generational cohorts and some of the similarities between them, and then some find themselves kind of in the cusp between the two. So there's certainly a number of things that we've talked about over the years, and one of the things I thought you might enjoy most is not only to understand those generations and what their particular attributes are, but how do we address their particular needs and communicate to them? If you're in a business and you have individuals along different generational lines, they may perceive the world differently. They may hear your instructions differently. If you're in a church, and I suspect most of the listeners are in church, you have different multi-generational churches, and you recognize there is a difference there as well. So that's why I want to spend some time talking about this book, Sticking Points. It originally was 4 generations, now talks about 5 generations, includes Generation Z, or the iGen generation, and it's written by Haydn Shaw. He is an individual that has been researching this and helping clients deal with some of these generational differences for some time. Individual that has been at all sorts of different workshops. He's kind of a leadership guru. We have information about him in a variety of different places. If you go to his bio, it links you to mygenerationalcoach.com. Also have a link that's on our website, peopledrivenresults.com. And so, Haydn Shaw, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me.
Might just mention that in your preface you say at least once a week you have somebody say, when are you going to update Sticking Points? Because you don't have a Generation Z. Well, this new book has that. And it does show you how things have changed, because I think the first book came out, if I remember, about 7 years ago. And in 7 years, you're having people want you to change all sorts of different aspects of the book. So that's, in some respects, why this book has got this new cover, doesn't it?
Kerby, the other reason this book has this new cover is one of my millennial children is a graphic designer, and he said, Dad, the phone on the first cover looks like an iPhone 4. Nobody my age would pick up this book. You've got to get a new cover.
That's so good. So, let's see if we can give the generations a little bit. You know, we talk about traditionalists and baby boomers. We talk about Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z. Can you kind of sort that out for us for a few minutes? Because if nothing else, that might help everybody kind of figure out which groups are where they fit. And then as you start talking about some of their attributes, they can see whether or not they fit those or whether they are very different than some of the people in their generational cohort.
Well, first of all, can I just say I appreciate two things. First of all, that you recognize that Gen Z and iGen are the same generation, and, you know, not everybody who interviews me does. And secondly, that cohort groups are kind of the technical term as opposed to generations.
Well, that's good.
And so it's just exciting to talk with somebody who knows the language. And so traditionalists, that group of people who, were born 1900, although many of them have passed on through 1945, And then the baby boom, of course, after World War II, there was a surge of births as Johnny came marching home. And 1946 through 64, most people agree around baby boomers. Now, Gen Xers, or baby busters, was kind of the original name in contrast to the baby boomers, as you already mentioned, 65 through 80. Now, I go a little longer on Gen X than some researchers do. Some people put them in 1976, 1977. I stop them in 1980. And then millennials, 81 through 98. And then Gen Z is born after 98.
And I think that fits very well. And that's kind of the way we've used that as a presentation. And the other thing I love about your book is the cuspers, because having had a daughter, for example, born in 1979, she's not really necessarily a Gen X or a millennial. She's sort of in the cusp. And I think you also can identify between millennials and Gen Z. Some people cut it off at 95, others at 98. So right. There are some very important aspects. Frankly, just the first chapter of your book is worth the price of the book. But let's get into the real reason why you wrote that, and that's why you call it the blue screen of death. Now, those of us that have computers, and I imagine most of our listeners do, although I do have some listeners that say I stay away from computers as much as I can, the right. Blue screen of death is, well, when everything's gone wrong, and you call that the difficulty of leading 5 generations. Some of our listeners have businesses or organizations or corporations that have maybe most of those generations. Many of our people go to churches that are multi-generational churches, and trying to lead everybody is like trying to herd cats, isn't it?
Well, that is a very apt description of it. Yeah, the good news, at least in a business, is you pay people to be yes. at least pleasant with each other across generational differences, although Kerby, the World of Work, Ronstadt's World of Work's international survey discovered that the different generations in the workplace spend only 45 minutes with each other.
Wow.
Unless they're sitting next to each other in a meeting or such. When it comes to time that they're given the ability to hang out, they hang out by generation, and it's not significantly different than that in churches. Now, ironically, I wrote a book about 5 years ago, time flies, called Generational IQ, Christianity Isn't Dying, Millennials Aren't the Problem, and the Future's Bright, where I talk about, research around how does generational research help people in churches understand their church, their family, and even spiritual growth and temptations from a generational perspective. So in that case, we went into more depth on how definitely 4 or 5 generations in church is the first time we've ever had to deal with that. And, we usually get good at dealing with something 20 or 30 years later, but it takes a while to practice at getting all those generations playing nice in the sandbox.
Talking with Haydn Shaw, and again, the book is entitled Sticking Points, and it is published by Tyndale. Should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link to his website. Of course, we have information where you can get it both in hardback and Kindle. And I think since we're getting close to a break, let's maybe after the break get into the sticking points, because we've talked about 5 generations, and if you have the old book with that phone on it, that will say 4 generations, but now this one includes iGen or Generation Z, which whenever you want to use it. And most importantly, we're going to talk about these sticking points, and there are 12. So we've already given you something you can number 1 to 5 if you would want to do so. And I know some of you actually listen to this program and take notes or go back and listen to it again. And so 1 to 5, of course, will be the traditionalist. Then number 2, the baby boomers. Number 3, the baby busters or Gen Xers is probably a better way to call them. And then Gen Y would be millennials. And then finally Gen Z. And those would be the 5. But when we come back, you could number 1 to 12, because we're going to talk about these 12 sticking points. And they can be very significant in terms of communication and loyalty and meetings and policy and training and even the work ethic and things of that nature. And if you have not seen this, then you probably haven't been interacting with people of multi-generations. Most of you have, and you might get some great insight from Haydn Shaw. So we're going to come back and continue our conversation with him, and then we'll open up the phones in case you'd like to join the conversation. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
One of the criticisms of the claims of human-caused climate change is that the theory predicts everything. Now, you might think that makes it a good theory. Actually, when you have a theory that predicts everything and cannot be falsified, that makes it a bad theory. In fact, it's easy to find examples of contradictory claims all being attributed to climate change. But let me give you one example. Sharks fascinate us, probably going back decades to the movie Jaws. We seem fascinated by them as illustrated by the popularity of Shark Week on television. So what do scientists predict about sharks and climate change? One article from a few years ago in The Guardian explains that the surge in fatal shark attacks is blamed on global warming. The article does acknowledge that some of the increase may also be due to human activity and the abundance of seals, but the primary reason for the surge in attacks is climate change. A more recent article in The Independent predicts that global warming could actually make sharks smaller and less aggressive. The argument is that warmer waters and increased CO2 could make it more difficult for sharks to catch prey. A third article comes from scientists in Australia who believe that a new hybrid shark just discovered is a sign of global warming. They argue the two species mating is due to climate change. Just about every phenomenon in nature is being explained by climate change. More snow is due to climate change. Less snow is due to climate change. More wildfires are due to climate change. Fewer fires are due to climate change. You will find lots of contradictory examples all attributed to climate change. So when it comes to sharks, many of these claims sound less like science and more like science fiction. Sometimes the claims sound more like the science fiction disaster movies like Sharknado. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Haydn Shaw with us as we talk about his new book, Sticking Points. Of course, you have the old book, which has the old phone and then the so-called new iPhone for 4 generations. This one is just out, and it has the 5 generations, includes Gen Z. And we have talked about the 5 generations, but now let's, if we can, Haydn, talk about the 12 sticking points, because these are significant, and each one of them surfaces in your business, in your family, in your church, in your community group. And so it's really important to understand that sometimes generations view issues like communication and work ethic and respect very differently, certainly dress code. So talk about those if you might.
You bet. You've done a great job, listing off half of them. And so let me just go through them in order real fast. Communication, decision-making, dress code, as you mentioned, feedback, different views of fun at work, knowledge transfer, loyalty, meetings, policies, respect, training, and work ethic. A sticking point is anytime we answer the same question differently. Let's take an example outside of work. So let's say a young woman is talking about her wedding, and she wants to get, she's trying to talk her father and mother into a $2,300 wedding dress. But she also mentions she wants to wear flip-flops.
Yes.
At least at the reception, if not in the service. And her dad's like, no. If you're going to get a designer dress, you are not wearing flip-flops. To her, it just makes complete sense that you would wear flip-flops. And I mentioned it to my daughter, and she's like, well, of course I'm wearing flip-flops, at least at the reception when I get married. Whereas to him, it's like, if I'm spending this kind of money, you can get married at something off of eBay for $200 if you're wearing flip-flops. Generational sticky, same question, completely different answers. And Kirby, they stare at each other like they have lobsters coming out of their ears.
I know. It's just the deer in the headlights, and it's just the quizzical look, and again, the nipper the dog look, which again only the traditionalists and the baby boomers even know what I'm talking about. But nevertheless, that's half of the fun. Before we get into the different groups and the different cohorts, there's one other aspect that I want at least set on the table. So I want to set the table, and we'll work through that, and that is you have steps for leading through those differences, because that's things like acknowledge, appreciate, flex, leverage, resolve. And again, so much practical information in this book. But again, you are going to help us as we go through some of these challenges and some of these sticking points, help us understand how we can resolve the potential tension or lack of maybe agreement about some of those issues. And a lot of that comes by treating people with respect and being gracious in the conversation.
It just helps a lot, doesn't it, to be curious rather than confident? You know, we can be confident in our own views, but we can't always be confident that we understand the world the same way somebody else does. And so it's just good manners and graciousness to be curious about how they see things, even if we don't see it the same way or end up at the same spot. And just a good dose of curiosity and, careful manners and graciousness goes a long way. And you're right, those 5 steps can give us a very practical process. And I use those 5 steps in each chapter. And I'll let you in on a kind of little behind the scenes. One of the editors at Tyndale said, the fact that you do each of 12 sticking point chapters with the same 5-step process makes it a bit redundant. I don't know that people will read all 12 chapters. And I said, I don't expect them to read all 12 chapters. I don't read all the business books I have. I flip to the chapters with stuff I need. And so, I've just been surprised at how many people have read all 12 of them. But it's a simple process because I wanted people to not have to figure it out on their own. I just literally wanted to spell out, do this, follow this process.
I just love it. It's step by step. And before we get to those sticking points, let's, if we can, since you have 4 or 5 chapters, actually, chapters 4 through 8, looking at these groups, just give us a little more detail about some of those, because after all, you took the time to write 5 chapters on everything from traditionalists to baby boomers to millennials. So what should we know about each one as then we get into those sticking points?
I'm so glad you asked that rather than jump right into the sticking points, because really the secret to being gracious to other people is, and understanding why we answer the same questions differently, why they're sticking points, is to understand, what shaped each of the generations and made them age cohort groups. Why they're a cohort based on when they were born as opposed to other things that make people similar. And so take traditionalists, for example. My grandmother, when she finally passed, they went into that farmhouse in Indiana, and in that cellar, they pulled out 2.3 billion Cool Whip containers that she had saved because they'd been through the Depression, and they may not have food, but they were certainly going to have a container to put in what they
That's
did
right.
if we ever got into hard times again.
And again, affected by the Great Depression, World War II. They were in the process of moving from the farm to the city. And so, again, about 22 million individuals, most of them are passing on, but not exclusively. Those are all those born between, the beginning and all the way to the end of 1945. So those would be your traditionalists. But then after World War II, you had this enormous baby boom, 3 million births each year, then 4 million births until 1964, and 68 million individuals part of the baby boom. And I might just point out, Haydn, that you talk about their names, their key events, their music, their top television shows, especially when you talk about the baby boomers and following, what makes the generation unique. And so in some respects, what else do we need to know about the baby boomers?
I think the most important thing to know is that because of that move from the farm to the city that you just mentioned, traditionalists had a lot of kids. And earlier traditionalists had a lot of kids. There were a lot more traditionalists than children. And then the traditionalists who moved to the suburbs and cities, they only had 2 or 3 kids. They had fewer children. And because they had fewer children, there was a lot more attention and expectations placed on them. So the baby boomers had a lot more expectations and frankly, a lot more stress. They've been 6% less happy than the other generations their entire life.
Isn't that amazing? Let's keep it moving, because then you have the third one, and that's Generation X from 1965 to 1980, and sometimes called the Baby Busters. But again, about 65 million of them. And again, you go through some of the key events, television shows, and those kinds of things. They were now starting to play video games. So there's a couple other things that are very unique about the Generation X, because in some respects they kind of got squished. They also were the first generation to see just a skyrocketing number of divorces. But what else do we need to know about them?
The economy began to bounce up and down. So whereas the boomers had, Tinkerbell sparkling pixie dust at the end of the, Wonderful World of Disney every Sunday night, on the other hand, Gen X, they had Bart Simpson and The Simpsons as their longest running show. And so it just gives the contrast of high expectations versus, Xers having economic ups and downs. A whole lot of jobs here in the United States and Canada went to other parts of the world, and there just wasn't the same expectations that the future was going to be as bright and the economy is smooth. And so all of that, as well as divorce, factored into them being a little more cynical and actually favoring comedy that was a bit more sarcastic and tongue-in-cheek.
Sure. Millennials from 1981 to 1998, for example, if you want to use that particular cutoff, about 82 million. And again, very influenced by a number of things that took place in that. Very significant parental involvement, snowplow parents, helicopter parents, those kinds of things. Also the consumer age, and even more influenced by things like the digital technology, which, of course, is even more significant when we talk about Generation Z in just a minute.
Well, definitely. And I think a key thing that's in the cutting edge of generational research is life stages. And so we emphasize that even more in this second edition. So the millennials were the first generation to have a significantly longer emerging adulthood, the time between they graduate from high school and then they move into early adulthood. Now that the average age of marriage is 30 for men and 28 for women in the United States, and has been for a couple of years, it's an extended time between adolescence and early adulthood that sociologists have identified over the last 15 years. And the millennials are the first generation to have a longer number of years. Boomers had 4 while they were in college, if they attended college. But millennials frequently have, 7 to 8 years of emerging adulthood. And so as a result, there's just a lot more freedom. And I did a TED Talk called "Well, Half of What You Heard About Millennials Is Wrong." And a lot of the negative characteristics that get placed on millennials are actually a product of this new life stage.
It certainly is. Let's take a break, and then we'll continue our conversation with Haydn Shaw. We'll also finish off Generation Z in just a minute, and then we'll get into those 12 places where they come apart. We'll see if we can cover at least a few of those and give you some insight from this book, Sticking Points, published by Tyndale. Look for it in your local bookstore. We have information about it on our website. We'll be right back.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Haydn Shaw. I know you would really enjoy this book, Sticking Points, How to Get 5 Generations Working Together in the 12 Places They Come Apart. Now includes Gen Z, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Published by Tyndale, about 320 pages, actually about 350 pages, that really get into the 5 different generations and the 12 different kind of sticking points. And just before we get into some of those, we did not have a chance to talk about Generation Z, sometimes called Zoomers or iGen. Again, 86 million, almost 87 million, born between 1999 and 2019. Again, key events, music, and all the rest. But this is oftentimes called the iGen generation because it is the first completely digital generation, and they are digital natives, aren't they?
You know, I refer to them in the book as born online.
Yes.
And other people grew up in it, but they are truly digital natives, and actually mobile natives.
Yes.
Many of us, I wasn't. I'm too old for that. I took a typewriter to college, but Gen X, many of them were native. Were native to it, not necessarily born into it, but they weren't born into the mobile. So that has some real implications for organizations. You're gonna need to design for the mobile phone first, and then for your website. And that, for a lot of us, has been a kind of a change and a shock to the system.
Well, let's talk about those sticking points, how to get 5 generations working together in the 12 places they come apart. Since you mentioned communication, that's chapter 9. And there we see instantaneous differences. I remember when we, years ago on this program, since I've been doing it for, actually a third of a century now, we used to talk about some of the surveys talking about how they communicated by text. And up until that time, nobody had even mentioned the word text because after all, it was usually by phone or it was by email. But the way they communicate and the way they think in terms of generations is very different. Can you explain that for us?
Oh, well, certainly. The older millennials would still use email. Younger millennials, people, in their early 30s and younger, they almost never use email unless it's to a boss or to an older relative who's using it. And so there are just some differences about what people prefer to use. Gen Z has 5 to 6 different online personas where they have different groups of people they invite,
right,
and they share different kinds of content with them. Whereas, baby boomers grew up in the heyday when we were very optimistic about what would happen online. And it was such a wonderful thing, whereas the Gen Z, they've grown up seeing the dark web and seeing how, information is used against you. And if you post too much, it'll be misunderstood or cause problems. And so they carefully curate their identity. And so just very different ways we use technology and communicate.
Well, and again, in terms of communication, the traditionalists would write a letter. Even some of the older baby boomers write a letter. Some of my younger ones don't know. The other day when I was doing the Millennial Roundtable, I said something about a checkbook, and somebody says, "What's a check?" And he was only half kidding, Whereas millennials, they'll send a text message. Vowels are optional, you point out, which makes some of my English teachers' teeth hurt. But nevertheless, it's just an unbelievable, the very different ways in which communication is taking place. And again, your goal here is to help us understand that those are differences, and for nothing else, to say to parents out there or grandparents out there trying to communicate to your son, daughter, grandson, granddaughter, if you send them an email, you may wait a month before it gets a response. You send them a text, you get a response instantaneously. So some of this isn't just helpful for the corporate world, it's helpful in terms of just basic communication within a family, isn't it?
Kirby, I always joke with my younger groups, and you may talk about this in your roundtable. If you want to make $1,000 a minute, next time you're with your grandparents, take your phone, shut it off, not just mute it, but shut it off so they can see it shut down, place it face down and slide it into the middle of the table, and then have a 45-minute conversation with your grandparents making eye contact. They will call their lawyer on Monday morning and change the will. You'll make $1,000 a minute because they want to know you can communicate the right way.
That's so good. I'm going to keep the train moving down the road because each one of these chapters is chock full of great material. But I thought, how about decision making? Because that's really very different. And it is surfaced when you've had some of these younger cohorts and some of these emerging adults graduate from college or even get an internship and then go into the corporate world. And they think that they are going to be involved in a lot more decision making than actually is the case. So that's where you see some of this conflict really surface kind of an ugly head, don't you?
Well, sure. Let me actually switch over to a church example since you had mentioned that aspect of things. I'll have, when I, consult with churches or denominations, I'll have younger people say to me, hey, when I was hired, they said, this is going to be great to get a millennial perspective. And then I give them a millennial perspective and they don't want it. I'm getting really frustrated. And I just laugh and say, no, they really do want your millennial perspective. But often your perspective is you have to change half to two-thirds of what you're doing for millennials, and that's not a possible move in the next 2 months. And so often you give them your perspective, and the answer is, oh, okay, well, good. That's more than we can do. So thank you for sharing your perspective. Great. Go back to work. And so very important to understand that when you're asked your perspective, it doesn't mean agreement, whereas people who worked much more collaboratively, your point, in college or, in school, often expect their opinion to have more oomph to it. And, you may be asked to sit at the card table at Thanksgiving for the first 4 or 5 years of your career and not invited to the big table until after you've proven yourself. And that's so different than we even did with families. I always joke that my father, here was a sum total of the discussion we had growing up about our vacation. He would wake me up and go, get in the car. That was the sum total of our dialogue.
Some of us have been down that road for sure. Again, the book is entitled Sticking Points. Haydn Shaw with us. We also not only have a link to his website, but Facebook page, Twitter post, and all the rest. Let's catch one more before we take a break, and it's one that I know people will appreciate, dress code. You gave us an example from weddings, but in some respects, this whole dress code is really significant. And if there is a generational difference, you can certainly see it in how different generations feel is appropriate to dress in the workplace, going to church, just hanging out, right?
Let's go back to weddings and go to the reception. I remember I was attending a wedding reception, and you could watch people come in by generation. The grandparents came in, and he wore a jacket, and she wore a dress. The parents came in, and he had a polo, and she had on, it was summertime, so she had on slacks and a sleeveless top. The parents did. The ex-relatives came in jeans, and the millennials were in with flip-flops and shorts. And you could just watch it roll in, the bridal party. You could watch it all roll in by generation at this event. And you see it the same thing in church. You just literally see it by generation. And people will joke with me. They'll go, well, hey, the best way to understand our church is by what the pastor wears when they do the service. And ours wears long jeans but untucks, or no, ours wears short, and sandals. And so you can literally tell kind of the vibe by asking the dress code question, because it sends important signals to who's welcome and what we're trying to accomplish.
And one of the things that you do talk about is, in order to have a conversation, sometimes you can just simply point out the obvious, and that is if in some employees you don't want to be wearing flip-flops because you could lose a toe or a variety of other things that might happen. So sometimes the conversation doesn't have to be generational. It just has to be occupational safety or whatever it might be, or the presentation that this particular company or business wants to portray to the customers. So in some respects, you do have an opportunity to use just basic common sense to talk about some of the dress code issues, don't you?
Sir, if we got time now, let's do it. If not, let's talk about it as soon as we get back from break. But in the book, I talk about 4 things. And if it passes these 4, then it's not generational. It's just like you said, just good common sense. You pointed out, are you going to lose a toe? Is it safe? The second thing is, are you going to lose money? Are you going to lose a donor if it's a nonprofit organization, or are you going to lose a customer? If you're going to lose one of those four things, it's not generational. If you're not going to lose one of those four things, then you're having a generational conversation, and that very practical difference can solve a lot of useless tension.
Very good. Let's take a break, and then we'll come back and pick out a few others. Again, I think you're going to find the book very helpful as we talk about these 12 places where sometimes generations come apart, but we want to talk about all 5 generations. We do this on Point of View on a regular basis. That's why you knew that we would certainly want to cover this book, and we'll certainly cover it with our next Millennial Roundtable, which we need to rename because, of course, one of our experts is a millennial expert. One is kind of an iGen expert, but we'll still kill it the Millennial Roundtable for now. And we'll come back and talk a little bit more with Haydn Shaw about the great insights in his book, Sticking Points. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Haydn Shaw with us. Just an outstanding book, Sticking Points, published by Tyndale. As we've mentioned before, about 360 pages and just great material. But I thought we might talk about one of the chapters that was helpful for me and is something that took me a while to recognize, and that is feedback. Because the older generation sort of just keep working, and if you mess up, then the boss will tell you. And I've got at least one millennial that just all the time wants to know, how am I doing? How am I doing? How am I doing? There are times you just want to go, you're doing fine, okay, but you just want, you want to score, you want to be clear, you want to make sure I need emotional support. You got to kind of hold my hand all the way through it. And I began to realize that's just a need that he has, and it wasn't just necessarily just from emotional deficit from his family upbringing. It's just the way in which he was looking for all sorts of affirmation, each step along the way. But if you're used to just keep your head down, work hard, and if you mess up, the boss will tell you, that is really a very significant generational difference, isn't it?
Well, you have illustrated it so well. That's how older generations often think, is why are you asking for this much feedback? What was missing in your upbringing? And younger generations have been coached all their life. If I had trouble with math, I was supposed to try harder. Maybe I went and talked to the teacher. When my kids had trouble with math, they got a tutor. Mm-hmm. And it was specialists in doctors, specialists in psychology. If you needed help, you went and talked to somebody about it. There was, you pay somebody a little money and it helps your kid put their portfolio to get into college where it's more competitive. So they had a whole team behind them as opposed to figure it out on your own. And so, you got Gen X latchkey kids that are walking home with a key around their neck and put the casserole in the oven and have to take care of their own homework till one of their parents can get home. You got Gen X managers with millennials. Millennials are saying, hey, can you give me an example of a letter you've sent out like that? It was an example I was questioned about. They want a sample of a letter before they send it out. It's like, write it yourself. If I had a sample, I'd send it out myself. Why do they want a sample? Because they want to know, you've already done this. Give me the cheat codes to video games. Give me the secret tricks. Give me the hacks. Give me the inside track.
It's just, again, incredible. Another one I want to pick off real quickly is loyalty, and I picked that up when I started speaking, especially to some of the high-tech groups, some of the people that worked at places like Cisco Systems or Texas Instruments, and I began to pick up something very interesting, and that is, especially in that field, but now probably for the entire generation, hopping from one job to the other was almost essential because you would learn certain skills in one area of computer programming, and you'd get it somewhere else. The traditionalists out there say, you work for General Motors and General Motors will take care of you. You may have the same job the rest of your life. That isn't even possible for the younger millennials, Gen Zs, is it? Because actually staying in the same place, as you say, for 10 years might be the kiss of death for your particular career.
You summarize one of the big points I make is that I'd say there's one other piece to it, just to add on that, because you said it so well. When we're older, we move around less than when we're younger. So baby boomers moved 11 different times in their career, changed jobs 11 different times. They just did most of the job changes before 35. Millennials do most of their job changes before 35. Gen Z will do most of their job changes before 35. They'll just do it. They'll do more of them, and they'll have more as their career goes along, understandably. So that's all changed. The point of it is it's not that different. It's different, but it's not that different than it was for boomers. It's just that when we're 55, we forget what it was like when we were younger, and we're like, what's wrong with kids these days? The very same thing traditionalists were saying about us. And to your point, I was really surprised when researching the book. I didn't realize that age discrimination laws didn't exist in the United States until 1969, and therefore large companies would not even hire you if you were would interview if you were over 40 years old. So it's not that traditionalists were so loyal, it's that they were caged. They didn't have a lot of job options once they got older, and it was a sign against you to have more than 3 jobs on a resume in their world. Whereas it's a sign against you to not have 3 jobs on your resume if you're a younger Xer or a millennial.
Yeah, they start to wonder what's wrong with you because you stayed in the same job. Maybe you couldn't get any other jobs. And again, I am coming near the end here, but we've talked about some of the things like decision making and communication, dress code, and all the rest. But you have whole sections on loyalty, which we sort of already alluded to, and meetings and policies and respect and training. But if you can kind of summarize this, because near the end you talk about this idea of sticking together, and really the goal of your book and the goal of all the training you've done and of your various TED Talks and everything else is to try to bring these generations together. And a lot of that comes from just understanding that these various generational cohorts perceive the world differently, but we can work together if we follow some of the principles in your book. What would you say?
The very sticking points that can get us tangled up can also, the way you said it, if we'll just listen and understand how we see it differently, they give us opportunities to stick together in ways we wouldn't. You know, as I mentioned, we don't spend that much time together in the workplace across generations, and then we miss out on great opportunities. You know, it's really hard to speak to Gen Z about a product or a market if all you got is baby boomers and Xers making the decisions in the marketing department. If you're not listening to your Gen Zers on the inside, you're going to be tone deaf in your marketing to Gen Zers on the outside. And so we miss out on huge opportunities. And in our families, we miss out on great opportunities. What gets us tangled up and stuck can also be the opportunity to stick together in powerful ways once we listen to each other and understand each other. It's amazing what a little appreciation and good old-fashioned love can do to help us work together in ways that we didn't think possible.
Just before you go, let's mention that we do have a link to your website. There's a place for speaking, a place where people can contact you, follow your podcast, books, and those kinds of things. But if somebody'd like to have you come and speak to their group or their community group or their church or their business or corporation, you're available for that too, aren't you?
That's true, with very different costs for churches versus businesses. And so, yeah.
So again, just a great resource. And again, the book is entitled, one more time, Sticking Points, How to Get 5 Generations Working Together in the 12 Places They Come Apart. And Haydn Shaw, it's just been great to have you on the program. And thank you so very much for writing this book. And thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
I've been delighted. Thank you for having me.
Let's, if we can, just as we come down to the end here, talk about some of the resources. We certainly have a link so that you can follow Haydn Shaw both on his website, on his Facebook page, on his Twitter post. And again, really trying to look at 5 generations, those traditionalists born before the end of 1945, the baby boomers born between 1946 and 1964, Gen Xers born between 1965 and 1980, millennials born from 1981 to 1998, and Gen Z born after 1998. And that's one of the things that we have spent a fair amount of time trying to talk about on this program, so that, number one, we can reach out to that generation. And even if they don't happen to be listening to this program, you can understand more about them as well, and you can be much more effective. A lot of this book talks about these generational issues in terms of the workplace. But let me just mention the fact that, of course, since he's published with Tyndale, he could also, of course, speak to these issues in the church. And all of us, of course, are in church, and we can learn a lot more about that as well. We talk about generational and multi-generational churches, and we need this material just as well. Thank you for listening, and you've been listening to Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.